Hi, I'm Cellino, and I'm here to tell you that I'm the current owner of the Knox Mansion, and we feel very fortunate to be able to own this building and use it as our law office. The Knox Mansion is one of those few mansions on Delaware Avenue that have been basically preserved, and it is my intention to preserve it for the years forward. And we're also fortunate to be able to open it up to the public. On weekends, my brother Michael Cellino, retired physician, is our docent, and he provides a good history of the building and the family. The Knox Mansion, especially the interior of the building, is just spectacular, and I encourage you to take us up on those free tours on the weekends and come on in.
Welcome to the Knox Mansion, the current home of Cellino Law. I'm Mike Cellino, I'm Ross's brother, and I'm actually a retired physician. As we go through the house, if you get tired and you need to rest, you're welcome to sit anywhere you find a chair. There aren't any antique chairs here that'll collapse under you. And you're more than welcome to take pictures with or without flash throughout the tour. We'll start in the library, where I'll give you a little history of the construction of the house and the family that lived here. And then we'll take the tour room by room. So if you want to follow me into the library, we'll start there. Okay, our story begins with Seymour Knox I. And Seymour Knox was born in 1861 in a small town in upstate New York called Russell, New York, which is in St. Lawrence County, at the foothills of the Adirondack Mountains, very near St. Lawrence River and Watertown. And his parents were farmers. So he grew up, had a very difficult childhood and very humble beginnings. He, like other youngsters on farms, had to collect eggs and milk cows in the morning. And they grew potatoes because in that climate, that's about the only crop that you could manage to grow. And he very early in life decided he didn't want to spend the rest of his time digging up potatoes and asked his parents to send him to school. School in New York State back then was free, but there were a lot of expenses associated with going to school. You had to be able to buy the books and buy a lunch or bring a lunch and have decent clothing and have transportation. And your parents had to be willing to give up your services on the farm, which was probably the biggest sacrifice that they had to make, because they were quite poor and they couldn't really afford to hire extra hands to do what you would have done for free, obviously. But at any rate, his parents were very supportive and they sent him to school. And there was a one-room schoolhouse in Russell, New York, and he went to that school until he was 15. And he did quite well in school. And back then in New York State, if you stayed in school till you were 15, you could take a test. And if you passed the test, you could actually go on to teach high school. And so he did well in school, and he did very well on that test. And he went on to teach high school in the next town over where they had a high school. And he taught high school for about a year and a half, but then he decided he really wasn't cut out to be a high school teacher either. And like many young men in those days, he decided to seek his fortune out west, and he slowly migrated and got as far as Hart, Michigan, where he took a job as a clerk in a general store. And he found he had an aptitude for that and enjoyed that kind of work quite a bit. Meanwhile, growing up on a farm very near his, up in St. Lawrence County, was his first cousin, Frank W. Woolworth. Most of you who are at least my age will know who that is. I have young people who come on these tours and I mention Woolworth's name and they look at me with a stared glaze in their eyes and say, well, who's he and why does he matter? Woolworth was quite famous for starting the Woolworth Company, which was a very large chain of stores. So at any rate, his cousin Woolworth was brought up in quite the same way. He also was on a potato farm and he also didn't like that kind of work. He only went to school for a year or two, and then he went to Watertown where he got a job in a general store. And he also enjoyed it, but he felt that he could do it much better. Because back then, the way these general stores operated was that you'd go into the store and you'd tell the clerk you wanted to buy a broom, for instance, and he'd have to go to a cabinet, open up the cabinet, and show you the broom. Woolworth said, that's nonsense. You should have all of your merchandise on display on cabinets or on countertops so that people could see what you have. And they might come in to buy a broom, but they might see 2 or 3 other items that they'll purchase through impulse buying. Secondly, he said you should have set prices for everything, because believe it or not, back then they didn't have set prices. It was run almost like a Turkish bazaar. You'd go in and the clerk would tell you what he wanted you to pay, you'd tell him what you wanted to pay, and it'd have to go back and forth until you both finally agreed on a price that was acceptable. And Woolworth said, that's nonsense. Everything should have a set price. Thirdly, he said you should have big storefront windows so that people walking by your establishment can see what you have for sale, because you should display as much as possible in the windows. And again, they may not have had any intention of even coming into your store, but if they see something in the window, it might entice them to enter. And lastly, he said you should purchase all of your material that you have for sale direct from the manufacturer, direct from the factory, rather than through the middlemen who were in those days going from store to store selling all the merchandise to the merchants with a markup, obviously. So with those 4 principles, Woolworth quit his job and set up his own stores, and he called them Frank W. Woolworth 5-cent stores. He started out at 5 cents. 5 cents, of course, back then was the equivalent to almost $1.50 today, and you could buy a lot of merchandise for 5 cents. And he opened up small stores along the East Coast, and some were successes and some were failures. And after a while, his mother wrote him a letter, and his mother and Seymour's mother were sisters, and said, your cousin Seymour is working in that sort of a field out in Michigan. Why don't you write him and see if you two can work together? And he did, and Seymour came out to the East Coast, and they got together, and they formed a partnership. They'd always been very close friends, they're very close cousins. They were the best of friends, actually. And they formed a partnership on the basis of a handshake. They didn't use lawyers at all back then. Everything was done on a handshake basis. And they renamed the company Knox and Woolworth 5 and 10. They advanced to 10 cents at that point. And they built stores along the East Coast. And they eventually spread out to Western New York and started stores here in Western New York, in Lockport, Batavia, Buffalo, Erie, Pennsylvania. One of the first stores here in Buffalo was on Main Street, and some of you might recall it was next to A&A's and Kleinhand's and across from the Main Place Tower. And that originally started out as a Knox and Woolworth 5 and 10. After a few years, Knox really decided he wanted to be his own boss. He had moved to Buffalo by then, and he just loved Buffalo. He loved everything about Buffalo. He loved the people, he loved the businesses, the arts, the clubs. He just really got into Buffalo and loved it here. And so he wrote his cousin and said, I'd like to really be my own boss. Can we split the company? And again, on a very amiable basis, they did. They split it then into Knox 5 and 10 and Woolworth 5 and 10. Woolworth, however, continued to do all the purchasing for both stores, because with the larger volume of merchandise to purchase, he could get a better price. And they continued to build their company. They also took on 2 or 3 other not partners, but people that they'd work with, young men who were entrepreneurs, who wanted to do the same thing. And they did it in their own discrete areas of the country, so they did encroach on each other's territory. But they all purchased through Woolworth. So Woolworth did even better, because he had these other gentlemen who were purchasing from him and gave him an even better opportunity to get items at a good price. And he would go all over the world to buy whatever he was going to sell and to negotiate with the manufacturers. Around the beginning of the century, the early 1900s, there were other entrepreneurs coming onto the scene, such as W.T. Grant, G.C. Murphy, S.S. Kresge. These are people that you probably remember, and they all were starting their own 5 and 10s. And Woolworth was becoming very paranoid. He was a magnificent merchandiser. He was called the Merchant Prince, but he was also kind of a nutcase. He was very paranoid. He believed that these new guys were going to run him out of business. He worked his life and his business on the principle that he was the reincarnation of Napoleon. And he absolutely believed that he was Napoleon's reincarnation. So everything he did was based on how would Napoleon have done it. So in 1911, he called together his cousin and these 3 other guys and said, we've been doing well, but these newcomers are going to try and run us out of business if we don't do better. And he proposed that they form one solid, large company. At that point in time, Woolworth had over 500 stores, mostly along the East Coast. And Knox had the second number of stores. He had 112 stores here in Western New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Southern Ontario. The other 3 guys had 50 or 60 stores each. And because Woolworth was the big man in this negotiations, he insisted that the new company be called F.W. Woolworth 5 and 10. And the others agreed. They really didn't have any choice. So not only did they form the new company, But they also put it on the New York Stock Exchange, or the American Stock Exchange back then. They listed it as an initial public offering. And they raised $65 million in 1911 in this initial public offering of stock. That would be the equivalent of about $2 billion in today's purchasing power. So it was a huge amount of money, much more than they expected. And in addition to that, they kept control of the company. They kept over 50% of the company. At that point in time, Seymour actually sort of semi-withdrew from the day-to-day running of the business because he was actually a sick man. He had very high blood pressure, and there was no treatment for high blood pressure back then. And untreated high blood pressure, unfortunately, results in kidney failure, and he was slowly dying of kidney failure. So to backtrack a little bit, back in 1890, Seymour was living here in Buffalo. He was running his part of the corporation, and he was doing quite well. He probably was already a millionaire, I'm not sure, but he was doing well. And there were some girls visiting from Detroit, and one of the girls was Grace Millard. And she came from a different background altogether. Her father was the curator of the Detroit Institute of Art, which was and still is today one of the major art institutes in this country. So she was brought up with fine furniture and fine art. She was very well educated. She went to finishing school. She played the piano. She spoke French. All the sorts of things that upper middle class young ladies did back then. Whereas Seymour was basically a farm boy. But at any rate, they met at a party here in Buffalo, and they fell in love. And 6 months later, they got married. And her family was in Detroit, as I mentioned, and she wanted to go back to Detroit after they got married. And Seymour was a really, really nice guy, actually, and he agreed to go back to Detroit to make his wife happy. And they were there for about 6 months when Grace's father suddenly died of a heart attack. And he said, well, can we move back to Buffalo now? And she said, yeah, as long as my mother and sister could come with us. And he said, that's fine. And they did. They moved back to Buffalo. And they lived in several houses in Buffalo, one on Porter Avenue, one on Linwood Avenue. And then they built a mansion down here on Delaware Avenue at 1035 Delaware Avenue, which is still there. And they were living there. But as I mentioned earlier, Seymour was a sick man. And their eldest daughter, Dorothy Knox, was engaged to marry Frank Goodyear. And he was of the Goodyear family, another wealthy Buffalo family. They had nothing to do with tires, though. They were into banking and railroads and lumber. And Frank Goodyear was living in the corner of Summer Street and Delaware, which is 2 doors down from us here. And Dorothy was going to be moving into that house. And Grace wanted to be near her daughter. So Seymour bought this property. As most of you probably know, or maybe have heard, back in that time frame, Buffalo had more millionaires than any other city in the country. And a lot of them, or most of them, lived on Delaware Avenue. So there were mansion after mansion all the way from Niagara Square up to Gate Circle. As a matter of fact, Millard Fillmore, when he retired from the presidency, built a mansion right at Niagara Square. And it's at the site of where the Sattler building is now. But at any rate, the entire street was mansion after mansion. And there was a mansion on this site at the time that Seymour bought it. It was the George Howard House, which was a very large Italian Gothic style house. And the property that George Howard had originally went all the way from Delaware Avenue to Richmond Avenue. And so in 1914, he bought this property, and his friends congratulated him at the time for having purchased the finest house in Buffalo. And he thanked them, but he said, we're tearing it down. And the reason was Grace, not only did she want to live near her daughter, she wanted to be in a new house that took advantage of all the new conveniences that were coming into play at that time. He engaged an architect, Charles Pierpont Gilbert, who's a famous New York architect, and he called it a French Renaissance style. And they purchased the building materials, including the steel framework. The house has a steel framework. And the steel came from Lackawanna steel, which is the precursor of Bethlehem steel. In March of 1915, Seymour suddenly died. He was slowly dying, but he wasn't expected to die that quickly. And Grace was left with the dilemma of whether to go ahead and build this house or to continue to live at 1035 Delaware, which is a very substantial house. And like I said, she was a very remarkable lady. She decided to take it on herself to go ahead with her husband's dream of building this house. And we know that because she kept this ledger here. And in the ledger, she kept track of every expense that went into this house. Every bag of concrete, every piece of wood, every bag of nails, she would document in the ledger. She'd document who she paid, what the discount was if she paid on time, and she always took a discount, even if it was only 2 cents, and her check number. And so we know a lot about how this house was built based on this ledger. For instance, we know that she paid the common laborers 20 cents an hour, which is about $8 an hour in today's money. She paid the more skilled laborers 40 cents an hour, and the most skilled laborers got 80 cents an hour, which is almost $30 in today's money. And those were the guys who did like the plaster ceiling work and some of the woodwork and the marble work. We also know, like I said, she wanted a new house because she wanted to take advantage of all that was available back in those days. And she wanted an elevator, and she got an elevator. She had the Otis Elevator Company put in an elevator, and we know from the ledger that she paid them $10,000 for the elevator, which obviously was a tremendous amount of money back then, because in 1915 you could build a wood frame house, a standard wood frame house in Buffalo for $1,200. So the elevator alone in this house was the equivalent of 8 or 9 normal houses in Buffalo. One of the most important things that she had when she built this house was central air conditioning, believe it or not. Air conditioning was actually invented in Buffalo by Willis Carrier. But at any rate, he started the Carrier Corporation in 1915 here in Buffalo, and he installed central air conditioning in this house. And that turns out to be a very important point, which we'll get to when we're upstairs, because he had to put ductwork in for that air conditioning. And so this was probably the first house in the country, or at least in the city, that had central air conditioning, because like I said, the company was actually started here in Buffalo. And the company, it's no longer here in Buffalo, but the company still exists, and they still do make air conditioning. The house was always electrified. It never had gas lights. She wanted the gas starters in all the fireplaces, and she got that. There's 11 fireplaces in the house. She had a telephone. She had all these things that, again, were just new back then. So they started the construction of the house 3 months after Seymour died. He died in March. They started building the house in July of 1915, and it took 3 years to complete. And in 1915, then she moved into the house with her son, Seymour Knox II, and her other daughter, Marjorie. By then, Dorothy had married Goodyear and was living in the Goodyear mansion at the corner of Summer and Delaware. But at any rate, in 1918, Grace moved here with Seymour Knox II and Marjorie Knox. Seymour Knox II is the famous Knox that most of you will know of, because he's the guy who donated all the artwork to what was then the Albright Art Gallery. And he donated between 700 and 900 pieces of art to the Albright Art Gallery. And in the early 1960s, he donated the money to build the new Bunshaft addition to the art gallery. And at that point, they renamed it the Albright Knox Art Gallery. And he lived here until 1926, when he got married. His mother, Grace, built him a house on the back of the property as a wedding gift. The other daughter, Marjorie, continued to live here with her family until 1969, when she was becoming elderly and probably felt she needed to downsize a little bit. So she moved to an estate that she had in Florida, and she died a couple years later after that. And then in 1970, the family sold the house to the Montefiore Club, which was a Jewish men's club whose clubhouse on Edward Street had just burned down, and they needed a new clubhouse. So they purchased this house with the intent of turning it into their new clubhouse. And in doing so, they built a big addition on the back, which was their sports facilities. They were here for about 7 or 8 years, but then they went bankrupt. They couldn't afford the taxes, and they couldn't afford the mortgage, and they never were able to reconstitute themselves. They just couldn't put themselves back together. At that point, the bank sold the house to the Computer Task Group, which is a Buffalo-based IT corporation. And they used it as their corporate headquarters for about 30, 35 years. And in doing so, they had used the house portion in the front here as their offices, and they'd cut it all up into multiple cubbies. Most of the rooms that you're going to see as we tour it were divided up into cubbies, portable cubbies. And they did virtually nothing with the sports facilities that the Montefiore Club had built. And they consolidated all their offices in the year 2020, and they put this building up for sale, but they didn't really list it. And it turns out there was a developer from New York who was ready to buy it. He had plans already to convert it into condominiums. And my brother found out about it, and he approached Computer Task Group, and he made them an offer. And they preferred to sell it to him because he promised that he would maintain it as a historical house. And he did. So he bought the house in 2020. And in doing so, he tore out all the cubbies, and he has been working to restore it to some semblance of what it might have looked like when the Knoxes lived here. And with respect to the sports facilities, he gutted all that area and turned that into what are basically all the law offices now. He maintains an office here in the building, but most of the lawyers are in the new part, which has been remodeled for that purpose. Back in 1970, when they sold the house to the Montefiore Club, all the furnishings, all the artwork, and the furniture, and all the tchotchke and all that stuff was sent to New York City and sold at auction. There are a few items that are still here with the house. We're not sure whether they forgot to sell them or they forgot to send them to New York or whatever, but we have an inventory of everything that was sent to New York, and there are items that are still here, and I'll point those out as we go through the tour. Someone who must have had a lot of free time on their hands went through and added up all the figures in this ledger, and there must be a couple thousand pages here, and came up with $606,000. That would be the equivalent of about $17 million in today's money. But this ledger actually only goes from 1916 to 1918. As I mentioned, he bought the property in 1914. They actually started the construction in 1915. So there's a lot of expenses that aren't documented here. And Mrs. Knox used to tell her friends that she'd spent $1 million on the house, which is probably more accurate. And that would be the equivalent to about $30 million in today's money, making it the most expensive house ever built in Buffalo. I'm guessing she probably told the city assessor that she'd paid $600,000 because that's what's documented here to keep the taxes low. But I think in reality, it probably did cost her $1 million back then. To finish up with the family history, like I said, Seymour Knox II moved to the back of the property. Seymour Knox III has a couple sons, but one of his sons is Seymour Knox IV, who's actually my age, and he lives here in Buffalo. And I've met him many times, and he's given me a lot of this family history that I'm relating to you. And Seymour Knox IV has a son, Seymour Knox V, who's in his early 30s, I guess, and I'm told he's not married. The Marjorie, like I said, lived here until 1969 and then moved to Florida and passed away several years later. Dorothy, again, lived in East Aurora and then in Aiken, South Carolina, and then she passed away down there. So that, I think, brings us up to date with the construction of the house and the family. If nobody has any questions about any of that, we can talk about this room in particular. The paneling is all original. It's all walnut. And back in those days, they either chose walnut or mahogany for paneling. Mahogany was a little bit more expensive than walnut, so we think that Mrs. Knox maybe was trying to economize a bit, and she chose the walnut, but which was also expensive back in those days. The bookshelves are original, and you might notice they're only half height. And the reason for that is they liked to leave room above the bookshelves to show off the paneling and also to leave spaces where paintings could be hung. Mrs. Knox loved old master type paintings. Her son, as you know, Seymour Knox II, was a big fan of modern abstract art, but she didn't like that at all. She only liked realistic paintings. None of the paintings that are currently in the room are original to the house, but we've tried to replace them with paintings that Mrs. Knox might have chosen if she were still here. The fireplace is travertine marble, which is an Italian marble that's just not highly polished. The andirons are original. Like I mentioned, there are items here which were original to the house, and the andirons, which are Poseidon and Atlantis, are original to the house. The candelabra above the fireplace are also original. They were here when Mrs. Knox was living here. You'll notice in many of the rooms that we visit, there are pictures on the bookshelves and on easels, and these show what the house looked like when the Knoxes did live here. The ceiling, of course, is the original plasterwork ceiling. The windows, as you notice, are very large. Mrs. Knox wanted lots of light in the house. That's another reason she wanted a new house. So as we go through the house, you'll notice the windows are very, very large. The old house that was here that they tore down was a magnificent house, but it actually had very small windows because glass back then was quite expensive, and even wealthy people had to economize to a point. And so the windows there were small, which meant that the rooms were dark, and Mrs. Knox didn't want that. She could afford glass, and she did. Well, that is about all I can mention to you about the library. So we're going to move into the foyer, if you want to follow me. So this is the marble foyer, so named because everything you see is basically marble. And the significance of that is that back in the days, the time this house was built, marble was actually more expensive than other building materials relative to today's cost because it all had to be done by hand. It had to be hand cut, hand polished, and hand carved. Whereas today they have machinery to do all that, which reduces the actual cost substantially. But back then it wasn't the case. And a lot of these old mansions that have marble in them, it's not real marble. It's what's called faux marble. They have wood that's painted to look like marble. Because again, even wealthy people 150, 100 years ago couldn't afford a lot of marble. But Mrs. Knox could, and she did. So I've had folks come through this tour who work with stone and marble, and they're amazed at how well it's done and how tight the mortar joints are and how smooth the marble is. And they're even more amazed by the curvature that you see in the walls, that they were able to carve the marble to fit the walls in a perfect, seamless way. And they just can't understand how it was done that long ago. One other thing while I'm pointing out the marble is this particular door is a solid walnut. It's about 2.5, 3 inches thick. But you might notice it too curves with the curvature of the wall. And the guys who work with wood who've come through tell me that it would have been a very, very difficult process to do that back then, and they would have had to plane that down hundreds of times to get it perfect, and they're quite amazed at the workmanship that's in that. There's a skylight here, which is original, obviously, and there's lighting in the skylight so that at night we can backlight the skylight, and it's quite impressive to see. There's also a roof above it, so that the snow here in Buffalo wouldn't collapse it, and it's been very helpful to have that there. The railing is brass and bronze. That's obviously original. The stairs are also marble, and the pilasters above on the second floor there originally had 17th century Flemish tapestries hanging in between them all. And those were all sold at auction in New York in 1970 when the rest of the furnishings were sold. The room, when you first walk into the entrance, the first room on the left there, was the original telephone room. Back in the time this house was constructed, they only had one telephone in the house. And because of that, it was placed in that room. Mrs. Knox would have had a servant sitting in that room all day long just to answer the phone. That same servant, I'm guessing, probably took care of people who came to the door and probably also operated the elevator. As I mentioned earlier, the house always had this original Otis elevator. Back then, it had to be operated by manually, although now it's automated. And it still works. It's fully functional. But we don't use it on weekends when I do these tours because I don't have anybody to call if it got stuck between floors. And it has gotten stuck between floors. And it could be several days before they're able to retrieve your body, so we don't take that chance. The table here, the desk is original. That was the original furniture from when Mrs. Knox was here. And the art piece on top of it was also original to the house. We don't know exactly what it is, but when you look at the pictures, I think I mentioned when we were in the library that there are pictures in various rooms that show what the rooms looked like when Mrs. Knox lived here, and you can see that item in the pictures. It originally sat on a table underneath the Cellino law sign at the front desk. The portrait here is of Mrs. Knox. Now that didn't originally hang there, but we put it there, and the reason being, in 1915, the University of Buffalo really wasn't a university. It was 3 professional schools. It was the School of Medicine, the School of Law, and the School of Pharmacy. And the people who did the accreditation for the School of Medicine told them that unless they were affiliated with a college that issued liberal arts diplomas, they were going to withdraw their accreditation and they weren't going to be able to graduate doctors anymore. So they were scrambling to find money to do that, and they were coming up short until someone finally approached Mrs. Knox. And shortly after her husband died, she donated $500,000 to that cause. And with that money, they were able to establish what we today know as the University of Buffalo. They wanted to honor her in some way, like, for instance, naming the university after her or naming a building after her. But she was a humble lady, and she declined. She said, no, just take the money and do what you have to do with it. And it wasn't until they built the North Campus that they did build a complex of buildings, which are now called the Grace Knox buildings. And that painting hangs in one of those areas. The University of Buffalo allowed us to make a copy of it and hang it here to honor Mrs. Knox. But the original is still there at the University of Buffalo. I think that's all I can really tell. Oh, the chandelier is actually not original. The original one you can see in the pictures from the time of Mrs. Knox's residence here. That was replaced when Ross bought the building, and actually it's probably nicer than the original. Okay, this is the music room, so named because Mrs. Knox had a Steinway grand piano in one corner of the room over there, and in the other corner she had an organ. And the organ actually had pipes that went under the floor and came up through those Chinese wall hangings, so the music would come out through the front, and you'll notice there's holes along the sides of those hangings. The organ's gone, and obviously the piano's gone too, but those were the reason this was called the music room. The chandelier is original. It's a 17th century Austrian cut crystal chandelier. The mirror over the fireplace is original. The fireplace, of course, is original. Those two little gold tables alongside the fireplace are original to the house. As is the bureau underneath the TV. That's also original. Obviously, the TV is not original. The wall sconces are original, and they're interesting because they have little Wedgwood bone china inserts, if you look closely. And bone china, I discovered, was actually invented in England by Josiah Wedgwood. And it actually is made out of bone. It's 30% cow bone ground up with ash and clay to make bone china, which supposedly is more durable and translucent than regular china. The other interesting thing about Wedgwood is that his grandson, Josiah Wedgwood's grandson, was Charles Darwin, the father of evolution. I thought that was kind of interesting. The paintings that are hanging on the wall here are obviously not original, but they were just put there recently to honor Seymour Knox II. And they're by a rather famous Italian artist named Pietro Adamo. And he has paintings hanging in many of the museums around the world. The fireplace, as I mentioned, is original, and it's a gas burner fireplace. All the fireplaces in the house originally had gas starters. Most of them have been converted to gas logs too, as has this one. An interesting item is that in 1926, the curator of the Albright Art Gallery approached Mrs. Knox and offered to sell her a painting that he was marketing. And she looked at it and she said, no, it's a little bit too avant-garde for me. Like I said, she was a real fan of old master type paintings. It turns out it was this painting here, which was actually by Van Gogh. And it's one of his most famous paintings. It's called The Bedroom in Arles. Arles is a city in France. At any rate, she declined it, and a rich Chicago gentleman bought it and gave it to his wife, and it later ended up in the Chicago Art Gallery, where it still is today. But at any rate, she declined it for a couple $1,000s because she thought it was too avant-garde, and it was recently appraised at $200 million, so she lost out on a bit of an opportunity to invest in fine art back then. The decoration above the fireplace, the frieze, is classic. It's considered a classic design, as are the columns and the pilasters. The windows, as you'll notice, are very large, again, because she wanted lots of light in the house, and they're all French doors. So they all open up from the front yard to the terrace to the music room, and then the French doors here at the other side of the music room open up to the back of the house. When Seymour bought the property, it was still 5 acres. He was only able to purchase from Delaware to Oakland Place, but it was still 5 acres. And the back of the house had acres of gardens, beautiful gardens. So Mrs. Knox could entertain all the way from the front of the house to the back of the house and into the gardens. And she did a lot. She was a famous hostess and entertained lots of different people here. I think that's probably all I can say about this room, unless anyone has any questions. And if not, we'll move on to the next room. Okay, this is the drawing room. It actually served as the living room for the family when they lived here. It looked different back then, and it was much cozier because there were carpets covering all the floors. And Mrs. Knox had lots of heavy furniture in here, so that it was more warm and cozy than it is now. The design in this room is a little bit more elaborate than the previous room. They call this the Georgian room, actually. And the ceiling is actually quite a bit more detailed than in the previous room. The little adjacent area here was just an addition to the drawing room. And you'll notice the wallpaper in here was added by the Junior League when they used the house in 2021 as their show house. And the wallpaper shows all the different show houses that the Junior League has done over the years. And this house is represented in this wallpaper right here as one of the houses. And apparently it's hand-stamped and available someplace in Buffalo. I'm not sure where. It's quite expensive, I've been told, but it is commercially available. There's a portrait here, actually, of Mrs. Knox standing in her gardens. When Seymour bought the property, it was 5 acres still, so that there were acres of gardens behind the house. Mrs. Knox, they say, was an avid gardener. She loved gardening. And I'm not sure whether that meant she got down on her hands and knees and pulled out weeds, or whether she told her gardeners what she thought would look nice here and what would look nice there. Maybe it was both. But at any rate, there's a picture of her standing in her gardens. And there were beautiful gardens. She had lots of statues and fountains and topiaries and large lawns. Unfortunately, those were all torn out. When the Montefiore Club bought the building, they needed a parking lot, and they took out the gardens and paved it, and that's still there. There's a little bit of the garden still they viewed on the side here, but the rest of it, unfortunately, is gone. The fireplace is original, as are the andirons by the fireplace, and that's a portrait of Seymour Knox the First. He actually never saw this house. He saw the blueprints, he saw the plans, but as I mentioned earlier, he died 3 months before they actually started construction. But Mrs. Knox always had a portrait of her husband hanging there. And when the family sold the house, they donated that portrait to the Buffalo Club, where he was a member of the Buffalo Club. And it's still hanging there, but they allowed us to make a copy to restore it to where its place of honor, where Mrs. Knox would have had it hanging. The chandelier in here, we're not as sure about the provenance. It's a cut crystal chandelier, but we're not certain as to how old it is. The table in here is obviously not original, but it is a Kittinger table that was made specifically for the law firm by Kittinger to use as a conference table, and they do use it for that purpose. If there aren't any questions, we'll move on to the next room, which is the marble rotunda. Okay, well, this is the marble rotunda, so named, of course, because everything you see here basically is marble, including solid marble columns. There's 6 different types of Vermont marble in this room, and the ceiling is painted on canvas, and the canvas has been applied to the plaster. It's not fresco where paint is applied directly to the plaster. We don't know who painted it, but it's in a remarkably good condition. We don't think it's ever been restored. The motifs, the design in it, are very similar, if not almost identical, to the Raphael Loggia, which is in the Vatican, which Raphael painted, and which is copied in the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. The fountain is called the Trident Fountain. It's marble. It's actually Carrara marble, which is the marble that Michelangelo used to carve the statue of David. And it still functions. We don't leave it running very often because, unfortunately, the water splatters all over the floor. Someone told me that if you put pebbles or stones in the bottom, that'll stop the splatter. So I put stones in there, but it still splatters. Well, once the water fills the shell, it spills over, and then it goes directly to the sewer. It's not a recirculating fountain. Back then they didn't meter water, so it really wasn't necessary to recirculate. Even if they had metered it, I suspect Mrs. Knox wouldn't have been too concerned. But if we left it running for more than a minute or two, you'd see water would collect on the floor and would have to be mopped up. So we only turned it on for a moment or two to let everyone see what it looks like. Okay, so back in 1911, after Seymour received his share of that $65 million or $2 billion in current value money for the incorporation of the Woolworth Company, he went back to his hometown of Russell, New York, and built a high school. And he dedicated it to his mother because, as I mentioned earlier, there was no high school in Russell, New York back then. He hired Louis Comfort Tiffany to put in 3 large stained glass windows in that high school in 1911, and he did. And he and Mrs. Knox then became very close friends of Tiffany. And we think, although we're not certain, that Tiffany gifted this peacock stained glass window to Mrs. Knox as a housewarming gift when the house was built in 1915 to 1918. It's got a curve to it, and it originally was backlit by natural sunlight. But when the Montefiore Club bought this building, they unfortunately added offices to the back of the building here for their club offices. And in doing so, they covered up the sun exposure to that light, to that peacock rather, and artificial lights were put behind it, which don't really do it justice, I don't think. We are hoping to develop a better way of lighting it, and hopefully that will happen soon. But at any rate, a fellow was taking one of these tours a couple months ago, and he said in today's market, a Tiffany piece of that nature and that size would be valued at between $100,000 and $200,000. The light fixture in here is original, and it's hand-carved alabaster, which is a translucent type of marble-like material. As I mentioned, the back of the house originally was here, and it ended here with these curved French doors. And there was a big terrace in the back of the house that went all the way across the back, as you'll see as we move on to the next room. And so all these doors could be opened to the terrace, which would have been a nice thing to enjoy, I think, back then. Okay, we're going to move from the rotunda into the loggia now, which is this hallway here. Okay, we call this area the loggia, and it leads into the dining room. But a couple of the features that I'd like to point out are, one is the exterior stone here. This is the same stone that's on the exterior of the building, and it's limestone. The walls in this house are literally 2.5 feet thick, and they're solid. There's the limestone exterior, and then the interior is a steel framework, as I mentioned earlier, and then brick and concrete. So there's no airspace in between the walls here, and that's throughout the house. The interesting feature in here is the coffered ceiling, which is copied in Woolworth's mansion. Woolworth either had seen this house or visited this house, but he hired the exact same architect, Charles Pierpont Gilbert, to build his mansion on Long Island. And his mansion's called Winfield, which is his middle name, Frank Winfield Woolworth. It's very similar to this house. The exterior looks a lot like this house. I think this house is actually better looking, but it's 3 times larger than this house. And because, as I mentioned earlier, Woolworth was something of a megalomaniac, it cost 10 times as much as this house. It's got lots of gold leafing and so forth in it. It's unfortunately deteriorating because it is so large and so expensive that nobody has come to rescue it, and it may eventually be torn down. But there are other features that are also common to both this house and his mansion on Long Island. One of them are the entrance gates. As we came into the house, you might have seen those 2 brass and bronze massive entrance gates. Those are almost exactly the same gates that Woolworth has in his house on Long Island. The house, again, ended right here, and these French doors opened up to a terrace that ran along the back of the house. Unfortunately, that terrace was taken out when the Montefiore Club bought the building, and they put their offices back there. There's a picture here of what the terrace looked like, and it must have been a very comfortable place to spend a summer evening. She had lots of furniture and an awning over the top with lights in the awning. And again, all the doors in the back of the house open to the terrace. So as I mentioned earlier, she could entertain from the front yard to the front terrace to the music room to this area, and then open this up to the terrace and then out to her gardens. So it was built to impress and to entertain. I think that's all I can really say about this area. And we'll move on into the next room, which is then the dining room. Okay, this is the dining room. The paneling in here is also walnut. Mrs. Knox originally had silk wall coverings in between the walnut panels. Those, however, had deteriorated over the years and had to be removed. The painting over the mantel is of the Knox children, and it was done in 1909 by Harrington Mann, who's a Scotsman living in Scotland, who was famous for having painted the portraits of many of the members of the British royal family. So he was quite a renowned artist. And that painting was hanging in their mansion down at 1035 Delaware. And when Mrs. Knox moved here in 1918, she took it with her and hung it over the fireplace. The family eventually donated it to the Albright Knox Art Gallery, where it usually hangs. Right now, for whatever reason, it's not on display. But they did allow us to make a copy of it to put it back over the fireplace where Mrs. Knox had it. The fireplace is Carrara marble, again, the marble that Michelangelo used to carve the statue of David, and it's probably the most intricately carved fireplace in the house. This fireplace in particular is still totally wood burning. It doesn't have the gas inserts, and it still works. I've lit fires in there a couple times myself, and the house hasn't burned down or filled up with smoke, so that was good. The paneling here has been replicated because there was an original passageway here between this room and the kitchens, which lie beyond this wall, so that the servants could bring the food from the kitchens into the dining room to serve the family. Since we didn't have servants anymore, and since it wasn't a very attractive item, Russ arranged to have a carpenter rebuild wood paneling that matches the original, and they did quite a nice job. The room here was the breakfast room. And there you'll notice there's a fancy embossed tin ceiling and cove lighting, which lights up nice at night. During the daytime, it doesn't show very well. But they say that between 1926, when he got married, and 1936, when Mrs. Knox passed away, Seymour, who lived at the other end of the property, used to walk across the gardens every morning and have breakfast with his mother here in the breakfast room. So he was a very dutiful young man. She took good care of him, though, too. He went to Yale, and he graduated from Yale. And when he did, his mother bought him a Rolls Royce as a graduation gift. And he kept that his whole life. He drove it every day a little bit just to keep it in good running order. And when he died in 1990, it was sold for $500,000. So it was a fancy car. The plants in here are something we've added. They weren't here when Mrs. Knox was here, but I take care of them myself, actually, because when I was in practice, they used to teach us that if a patient walks into your office and the plants are dying, they should leave immediately. I don't think that applies to a law office, but I don't like to take any chances, so we try to keep them looking healthy. The floor in here has actually been replaced because, again, when the computer task group had this building, all these rooms which we visited were broken up into multiple cubbies. And the cubbies in this room had been attached directly to the floor, and it ruined it, so it had to be replaced. So the flooring in here is relatively new. I should point out the children in the painting. The one in blue is Dorothy. She's the one who married Goodyear and lived 2 doors down. The little girl is Marjorie, and she's the one who lived here until 1969 when she moved to Florida. And the little boy is obviously Seymour Knox II. He, again, lived across the way on the other end of the property until 1990 when he passed away. There was one other daughter. There was a little girl named Gracie, who unfortunately died when she was a little girl, I think 4 years old, probably of some sort of childhood infectious disease, which they couldn't treat back then, but we don't know that for sure. If you'll come down this way, there's built-in china cabinets here that are kind of interesting, and they would have kept the day-to-day china in these little areas, and even these little doors are solid walnut. In this one in particular, there's a little piece of artwork that one of Mrs. Knox's grandchildren apparently did when they were living here, and it's still there hidden behind the shelves that someone pointed out to us that was visiting the house, who was a descendant of Mrs. Knox. All right, we're going to move on then to the bedrooms upstairs, if you want to follow me. Again, originally, Mrs. Knox had 17th century Flemish tapestries hanging between all these pilasters, which were sold at auction when the house was sold. Okay, we're upstairs now in the bedroom area of the house. It's been modified over the years, but I'll try to point out how it once existed. The first room at the top of the stairs was the butler's bedroom. The butler had a bedroom here together with the family, as opposed to the rest of the servants who were in the servants' wing, which we'll see in a few moments. But he was the most important servant of the house, obviously, and Mrs. Knox always had a proper English butler. And again, he had his own room, and he had his own bathroom next to his room there. The next door was the elevator, or is the elevator. As I said, it still functions. This room here was actually the clothes closet for the room behind it. But at one point, the Montefiore Club had opened up the wall and turned it into a card room, I believe. But it originally was Seymour Knox II's closet, because he had the bedroom that was behind it. And I like to show this picture that was taken shortly after Mr. and Mrs. Knox were married, and it's actually signed by Seymour Knox. In the picture, you'll notice he looks a lot older than she does, but he actually was only a year older. But I think the effects of the high blood pressure and the kidney failure aged him prematurely. When he died in 1915, he was 54 years old. And like I said, he really was a very nice man. And he was eulogized by several of his friends as being the kindest, most trustworthy man they had ever known. And his cousin Woolworth called him a prince among men. He, of course, left most of his money to his family, but he had also made provisions for some of his former employees and had forgiven mortgages that he'd given out to some of his employees to build those $1,200 houses. So he really was a very nice man. He wasn't a robber baron type. And he had very few personal belongings, but he had a strange provision in his will where he mentioned that he wasn't making any provisions for his furniture and his artwork and his personal belongings in the will because they all already belonged to his wife. I don't think it's because she was a a stingy or domineering woman. It's because back then, men couldn't leave their wives their estate without paying a tax, although now there's a marital exemption, so a husband can leave everything he wants to his wife without paying any taxes on it. Back then, you would have had to pay taxes on your property, even if you left it to your wife. So I think if you state in your will that you don't own anything, she already owns it all, it avoids paying taxes on that amount of money. I'm just going to set this back here. And then we're going to move into Seymour Knox's bedroom. The first door here was actually Seymour Knox's bathroom, and it was a very large bathroom, but at some point it was converted into a men's room and a ladies' room, and it's all modern, so we don't really bother looking in there. But we can walk through here, and we find ourselves in Seymour Knox's bedroom. Currently, Ross uses this as his personal office. The room over in that direction is another closet. I think it was maybe Seymour Knox's clothes closet, or not clothes closet, but his shoe closet. The flooring in here is actually original. We know that because it's nailed on the face. And they didn't have a tongue and groove or side nailed hardwood floors back then, but they nailed it right directly from the surface, and you can see that on the floor. The floor, like I said, is original. It's been protected because over the years it's always had carpets over it, so it looks almost brand new. These light fixtures in the room are actually also original to the house. And again, upstairs here, there's lots of light. The windows are very large, brings in lots of light. Ross tells me he very rarely has to turn his chandeliers on because he doesn't need them during the day. When we get here, I like to point out this picture of our father when he was a little boy because he was so cute. He grew up like Seymour Knox the first, in a rather humble beginning. His parents were Sicilian immigrants, and they were farmers in Sicily, and they were farmers here in this country, and they never made any money, and he had to put himself through college and through law school. And he only died a couple years ago, but he lived long enough to see one of his sons become a very prosperous and famous local plumber. And then this is a picture of our mother. She just died a couple months ago. She also was the daughter of Sicilian immigrants. Actually, all four of our grandparents came from the same town in Sicily. And she was an identical twin, and her twin were acting as flower girls for one of their brother's weddings here in this picture. The problem is we don't know which one she is, and she didn't either. She said, my mother usually put me on the left, but I'm not sure if that's me or not. And those are a couple of, those are Ross's children. The next room was Seymour Knox's study. He had a study separate from his bedroom where he had a desk and a couch and his bookshelves, and he had quite a comfortable setup in there. And it's now used as Ross's secretary's office, and we can go into there. You gotta be careful, there's high thresholds or doors between each of the rooms, which I'm not sure why they're there, but they're a source of potential injury. You know, they deal in injuries here, but they prefer they not occur in this building. I'd like to point out, as we go through these rooms, we're going internally through all the rooms. There's a big hallway in the middle, but we don't need to use the hallway because Mrs. Knox had it set up so that she could go from room to room in the morning to see her children and her grandchildren without going into the hallway where the servants would be coming and going. So they're all connected except for the butler's room. His room is separate because she had no reason to go into his room in the morning, I would hope. But you can walk through here. The fireplace is obviously original, as is the mirror above the fireplace. And the bookshelves are original, but there's not too much else in here that is original. The floor is also original in here too. The next room was just a spare bedroom that Ross uses now as a conference room, and there's really not too much to see in here, but we'll walk through here too. I suspect that probably one of Mrs. Knox's grandchildren used this as a bedroom. Like all the bedrooms up here, it had an ensuite bathroom, which would have been the next room. The bathroom at some point in time was removed and turned into a secretarial area, so there is no bathroom there now, but this next room would have been the bathroom. If we want to continue, again, be very careful, there's a very high threshold here. So this end of the house was the master suite. There's another skylight here. The bathroom to that bedroom would have ended right here, and that would have all been bathroom, and then this would have been the entrance area to the master suite. When the house was designed, it was anticipated that Mr. Knox was going to live here too, and back in those days, wealthy couples had their own bedroom. So the room on the right here was designated as Mr. Knox's bedroom, and the room on the left would have been Mrs. Knox's bedroom. Of course, he never saw this house. He never got to live here. So Mrs. Knox instead used this room as her study, or her boudoir, they would have called it back then. And in that room, she had another Steinway piano, and she had her desk, and she would meet with the butler every morning to go over the business of the day and plan out the menu of the day. Right now, it's set up as a guest room because Ross uses this end of the house sort of as guest rooms if there are friends or family visiting from out of town, or sometimes the lawyers from the other offices of downstate are coming to Buffalo for meetings and so forth. He allows them to stay here, so it's sort of like a B&B, if you will. If you want to come on through here. So again, although it's set up as a bedroom now, it was Mrs. Knox's boudoir. And again, where she would hang out in the morning and meet with the butler and play her piano and write her letters, because they didn't have email back then, and people of her stature would be generally writing letters every day to various friends and family. The fireplace is obviously original, as is the mirror above the fireplace, and the woodwork's original, but there's not too much else in here that actually is original. But it's very quiet, you'll notice, because like I mentioned earlier, the walls are solid. And even though there's a busy street there, you almost hear no noise at all from the street. So that wasn't the reason she chose the other room to be her bedroom. I think it's just that the other room, which you'll see in a moment, looked out over the gardens in the back of the house, which I'm sure was something she was interested in. The room behind us here is the original master bathroom. And it's all marble, and it's worth seeing. It's quite elaborate. It's not very large. Nowadays in big houses, they have these huge master baths. But back then, you have to remember, a lot of houses had outhouses. So just to have a bathroom at all was a plus. The room in the middle here was her closet, her clothes closet. And originally, it had lots of built-in cabinets and dressers and armoires and actually safes. Those were all removed at some point, too, and it was turned into, I think, another card room. So there's nothing really in there now. The room in the middle was her makeup room, or her dressing room, and there's a picture in there that shows all the stuff that she would have used back then. And then the last room in the suite was the room that she actually used as her bedroom, which we can go into if you'd like. So this was the clothes closet at one time. Again, it functioned as a closet back then, but at this point it doesn't have any resemblance to that. The room here again is the bathroom, and then this was her dressing area and her makeup area. And then she had a balcony or a terrace here, which she could go out and sit on a nice day. And she could talk to her neighbor, Mrs. Clement, who lived in the Clement mansion next door. And their houses are rather close to each other. So, and she was a widow too. Mrs. Clement was a widow. So the two widows could exchange neighborhood gossip and borrow a cup of sugar from each other, I imagine. Her husband, Stephen Clement, died in 1911. And when he died, Seymour the First bought his stock in the Marine Trust Company, and he owned a large chunk of Marine Trust stock. And that later became Marine Midland Bank, and later became HSBC Bank. So the family owned a large amount of bank stock, and of course they always owned the Woolworth stock that they got back in 1911. So they never really suffered through the Depression at all, especially because Woolworth was actually one of the few, if only, companies that continued to pay a dividend throughout the Depression. Back then people couldn't afford to shop at fancy stores like Hens and Kelly's and AM&A's, but they still needed certain items, and they could afford a nickel or a dime, and so they shopped at Woolworths. So Woolworths prospered during the Depression, and they were able to pay a dividend. It wasn't until 1933 that they increased the maximum price to 20 cents, because although it was called a 5 and 10, and it literally was, nothing sold for more than 5 or 10 cents until 1933 when it went up to 20 cents, and then a few years later all hell broke loose and they charged whatever they wanted to charge. And now, of course, Woolworths is out of business for whatever reason. To mention again about the Marine Midland stock, because the family did own a large chunk of that, Seymour Knox II was actually chairman of the board of the Marine Midland Bank until 1970 when he retired due to age. He was also on the boards of many other companies in the area and was very influential in a lot of the businesses in the Buffalo area. So there behind the cameraman is the actual bathroom, and it's all pretty original. And actually everything functions in there. We don't really use it because it's antiquated, and there's a new modern bathroom that's been put in for the use of the guests who do stay in this area. But it's kind of an interesting room to take a peek at. The next room was Mrs. Knox's actual bedroom, the bedroom she used until she passed away in 1936. So we can walk through here and take a look at this. Now, I'm pretty sure she chose this to be her bedroom because back then it was all gardens back here. Nothing that you see here now was there, basically. It was all the beautiful gardens. She had 4 to 5 acres of gardens in the back. And if you look closely, you can see the red brick house that she had built for her son, Seymour Knox II, as a wedding gift in 1926. And he lived there until he passed away in 1990. When the Montefiore Club bought this property, he was living there and he still wanted to live there. So they had to divide the property, and that's when the stockade fence went up that you see. And in addition, when the stockade fence went up, the carriage house to this property ended up on his side of the fence. And the carriage house is that gray stone building that's down to the right there, which actually is sort of a miniature version of this house. And it's quite a large building. I don't know exactly, but I'd guesstimate that it's at least 10,000 square feet. The house itself here is 28,000 square feet, and the addition that the Montefiore Club built onto it is 20,000 square feet. And then again, the carriage house, I think, is probably about 10,000 square feet. The carriage house had the furnace in the basement, and it was a coal-burning furnace that generated steam because the house was heated by steam heat and radiators. And when the Montefiore Club bought it, they didn't realize that the furnace went with the other end of the property and they had no way to heat the house. Seymour let them use the furnace for a while, but he eventually told them, you're going to have to heat your own house. And that would have been a very difficult proposition if it hadn't been for the fact that the central air conditioning was built into this house at the time of initial construction. Because as I mentioned, the walls are solid. It would have been impossible to put ductwork in, but there was all the ductwork present. And if you've noticed throughout the rooms we've been, all the ducts and the grates are from the original air conditioning, which they were able to retrofit forced hot air furnaces in the basement to, so they could both heat and air condition the house at the same time. There's 27 forced air furnaces in the basement now to heat this house. When we get to the servants' wing, you'll notice that unfortunately Mrs. Knox did not air condition the servants' wing when it was built. She was a very nice lady, but she didn't air condition her servants' rooms. And as a result, there was no ductwork there, and they had to hang ductwork from the ceiling in order to heat them when they bought the building. And you'll see there's still ducts hanging from the ceiling, and that's currently what's being used. The first floor, the ground floor of the carriage house, is set up for both horse and carriage and cars, because they were using both at that time. And on the car side, there's 3 bays. And we know from inventories that Mrs. Knox had a Rolls Royce, a Pierce Arrow, and a Buick. And in those bays, there's turntables, so that when the car was pulled in, it could be automatically turned around and pulled straight out. Because cars back then were very large and unwieldy and didn't have power steering, and so it was quite an ordeal to maneuver them. But the turntables made that easy. The second floor of the carriage house actually has 4 apartments, and they're multi-bedroom apartments. And the servants who lived in those apartments could be married and have children, and they were. And we know that 2 of the apartments were occupied by chauffeurs. She had 2 full-time chauffeurs for whatever reason. And the other 2 apartments were occupied by the full-time gardeners and their families. And they did. They were married and they had children who lived there. The buildings that you see on the side here were all the addition that the Montefiore Club put on, and those are the ones that where the current law offices are. You'll notice from the picture here that Mrs. Knox had 2 beds in the bedroom, and she never remarried, but her sister, Mary Lillian, who came to Buffalo when her father died, lived not in this house, but in an apartment that the family bought her on Delaware Avenue here. But she visited here very, very often, and when she did, she would stay in this room with her sister, and that's why there's 2 beds. The fireplace is original, the floor is original, and there's really not much else in here to point out, but those are the original features. The next room was actually Mrs. Knox's mother's bedroom. As I mentioned earlier, her mother and her sister moved to Buffalo with her after they got married, and her mother lived here until 1926 and used this bedroom until she passed away in 1926. And then the room beyond that was her mother's bathroom, and that's still very original and intact, and we'll walk through and take a peek at those rooms. So if you want to come this way. So Ross's grandchildren actually use this room now. They go to Narden, and he picks them up, and they get out at 3, and they're here till 5 or 6, so they use this room to take a nap and do their homework. But again, this was Mrs. Knox's mother's room until she passed away. I tell folks I'm not certain, but I'm guessing she probably used the bottom bunk. The next room, again, it was Mrs. Knox's mother's bathroom, and pretty much everything in here is original to that time. And then we're moving into Marjorie, of course, is the daughter that lived here until 1969, and this is the room she used with her husband. It's been converted now into a game room for the grandchildren, obviously. I like to point out that there are 2 carvings in the pilasters here. One is apparently of Marjorie and one's of Dorothy. We're not sure which is which. But these are another item that Woolworth either saw or liked or knew of, because he has the exact same carvings in his house on Long Island, only his are in marble. And he had 3 daughters. And his youngest daughter, Edna Woolworth, was actually married to the brother of E.F. Hutton. His name was Franklin Hutton. And Franklin Hutton was apparently a notorious womanizer, and Edna was becoming very upset with him. And one night they were staying at the Plaza Hotel in New York, and instead of killing him, she killed herself and committed suicide. But her carving in her father's mansion cracked the very night that she committed suicide, diagonally. And you can still see that online. There's pictures of her carving with the diagonal crack in it. And again, they claim that it happened the night that she committed suicide at the Plaza Hotel. They were married, as I said, and they had 1 daughter, Barbara Hutton. And Barbara Hutton is famous as the poor little rich girl. And the reason being that when Woolworth's widow died, Barbara inherited her mother's share of the Woolworth fortune. So when she was 12 years old, she inherited $300 million, and that made her the poor little rich girl. She ended up getting married 7 times in her life, and she ended up building houses all over the world. One of her husbands was actually Cary Grant. And when she was married to Cary Grant, the couple was known as Cash and Cary. One of the houses she built was in London, and it's called the Winfield House, named after her grandfather. And it's still there. It's quite a spectacular house. And it's owned by the U.S. government now. And the ambassador to Great Britain, from the American ambassador to Great Britain, lives in that house. And it has a 12-acre garden right in the middle of London, which makes it the 2nd largest private garden in London. So the Knoxes were related to Barbara Hutton. The other connection is that Dorothy Knox's second husband, as I mentioned earlier, her first husband died in 1930 in an auto accident. Well, her second husband was Edmund Rogers, who grew up along the Hudson River next door to Franklin Delano Roosevelt and was one of FDR's best friends. And his brother rather, was best friends with Wallis Simpson, who's the woman who married King Edward VIII. And actually was the guy who gave her away at her wedding date. And after they became the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, after he abdicated, Dorothy Knox and her second husband, Edmund Rogers, often entertained the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. We don't know that they ever entertained him here in Buffalo, but we do know that they entertained them in their southern estates. So the Knoxes were related to the Huttons and Cary Grant, and then they knew the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. There was a connection there with lots of different famous people, which I thought was somewhat interesting. The next room over was Marjorie's original bathroom, but that had been completely gutted at some point and turned into a storage room, and it's been converted now into a modern bathroom that functions for the guests who stay in the guest rooms so that they don't have to use the original bathrooms, which all work, but they don't work very well. But this bathroom does. And obviously now it's used as a game room for the grandchildren. And that's this room. And again, we can walk through here, and you can take a peek into this bathroom if you'd like, but it's not original. There's nothing, it's all modern. So we're going to head down now into the servants' quarters, if you want to follow me. So you'll notice right away that the character of the construction here is quite a bit different. The ceilings are obviously much lower, and there's 3 stories here rather than 2. There's 2 floors of servants' rooms. There's another floor above us, which is almost identical to this floor, with servants' rooms on the right and then workrooms on the left. There's 12 altogether, and we know that the most house servants Mrs. Knox ever had was 12. In later years, I think she was able to manage to get by with fewer. And we know a lot about these women, and they were all women, because back in those days, they used to publish a city directory. And the city directory would list every address in the city and every person who lived in at that address. It listed their names, what they did in the house, how old they were, where they were from. So we know that she had 12 relatively young women who were in their early 20s generally, and most of them were immigrants from Ireland or England, and that they worked as laundresses and cooks and cleaning people and so forth. And again, each one had their own private room, and then there was a shared bathroom, which they used. These rooms on the other side of the hallway were service rooms. This room with the half doorway was the trunk room, because the family used to travel to Europe quite often. And when they did, they used steamer trunks, and when they weren't being used, they were stored in this area here. There's an interesting story that in 1926, after her mother died, Mrs. Knox took her children to Europe. And Marjorie at that point wasn't married, but she fell in love with the cruise director or the activities director on the boat. And Mrs. Knox, of course, wasn't too happy with that, but she was a dutiful mother and loved her children. And Marjorie insisted that she was going to marry this guy. His name was J. Hazard Campbell. And she wanted to marry him right away. She didn't even want to wait till they got back to the United States. So as soon as they landed in France, they found out that there was a 30-day waiting period that you needed to accomplish before you could get married. But Mrs. Knox allowed that. She stayed in Paris for 30 days, and Marjorie married Campbell. He was poor. He was, like I said, the activities director, but he came from an illustrious family. One of his ancestors was the hero of Lake Erie in the War of 1812, Oliver Hazard Perry, which was who was a famous American during the War of 1812. At any rate, she did marry this gentleman and in Europe, and they came back to the United States. She had children here with him, and he unfortunately died young too. He died in an airplane accident. He was trying to buy an airplane, and they were taking off from a field that the family owned in East Aurora, and Marjorie was in the car with her children and saw him crash and die. And she was and the children obviously were all quite traumatized by that. She went on to remarry several years later and lived with her second husband here in the house again until 1969. So we can walk through, and you'll notice again the ductwork's all hanging from the ceiling here. These offices are used by the law firm now for secretaries and paralegals. I think the bathroom is here. Yeah, no, this is a workroom. One of these rooms is a bathroom. Oh, here it is. Is this one here? Yeah. So this would have been a bathroom that the servants would have used, and that's all pretty much original. The stairway here leads up to the second floor of the servants' wing. So again, there were 6 more rooms up there for servants, and down to the kitchens. And then we can walk through here. Okay, when you leave that doorway, you're actually leaving the original mansion, and everything beyond it is the addition that the Montefiore Club put on. That again was gutted by Ross and turned into the law offices. And this obviously is just a staff room. And if you come around this way, you can see the back of the mansion there are those offices that the Montefiore Club put on to use as their administrative offices. And that's where that terrace existed, all along the back of the house, which again is gone. The area under here was the Montefiore locker room and showers and so forth, and now it's a patio for the staff to use in the summer. And then there's modern bathrooms here too. And again, we can continue to walk through here. And this was the basketball court for the Montefiore Club. And in order to turn it into offices, Ross had to lower the ceiling and had all the windows cut out because those were solid walls originally. And now the lawyers have offices with the windows, and the staff, the secretaries and the paralegals are in the cubbies here in the middle. These are the kind of cubbies that actually filled the mansion at one point. These are actually nicer than the ones that were in the mansion, but it's the same idea, and this is how the mansion was managed before, with all little tiny offices like that. All right, we're gonna head on this way. And we're going to go down these stairs. That's an old memento of Computer Task Group. I don't know if they left it here to remind them it was Computer Task Group or they were too lazy to remove it, but it's still there. Get some. So this is that area underneath the patio that we saw before that I mentioned was originally lockers and shower rooms for the Montefiore Club. And again, the lawyers have offices along the outside, and then all the secretaries and paralegals are here in the middle. You know, the first time I did this tour, when people saw all these offices, they asked me, how many people actually work here? And I said, I don't know, but I'm going to guess about half of them. But then I asked, and it turns out there's 55 actually. And I'm sure they're all very hard workers. We can come on through here. So these were some of the sports facilities of the Montefiore Club. These were racquetball courts and handball courts and squash courts. This room here in particular is now the phone pool, and the ladies in here answer the phone and then send the calls to wherever they need to go. The next room was, again, one of these sports rooms. And the interesting thing about this room, it's now an exercise room, but you can still see the walls are marked up by the balls that were used either in racquetball or handball. I'm not sure which, but now it's an exercise room for the staff to use. And then down this way, we have what was originally a double squash court. And again, they had to cut out windows, and now they've turned it into a pickleball court, and with a basketball hoop. And then there's a little viewing area above where your friends and neighbors can come and watch you and embarrass yourself playing pickleball, I guess. But from here you get a good view of the carriage house, which again is built similar to this house. It's actually very, very large. What you're seeing here is just the narrow end. The long access goes in that way, perpendicular to this wall, so that you're really only seeing a small portion of it. But it's a very big building. And actually the fellow who lives there now, the fellow who bought the house when Seymour Knox II passed away, still rents out those apartments. And they can be rented when there's a vacancy, I guess. All right, we're gonna head now back out of this area and back into the mansion, into the basement of the mansion. So when we get past these brown markers on the wall, we're actually back into the main mansion in the basement. And we're truly in the basement. There's a lot of rooms down here that are old service rooms and work rooms and laundries and so forth, which we don't show on the tour because they're really not that interesting. But we'll walk through here because this leads us to the ballroom. So this is the lower lobby. This is the lobby below that marble lobby that you entered into the house from. And it was the lobby for the ballroom. There was a separate entrance, which is that door there, which is a different entrance than you came into. But guests would have come in through that entrance and congregated here and then went into the ballroom. The first door there was the butler's office. He had his own office, and he had his own bathroom, and that's still intact. The janitor now uses it as his office. The next door was actually a big walk-in safe. That's the elevator door. That door is to a bank of bathrooms, which served to accommodate people in the ballroom. And then the room behind us here was the billiard room. And it hasn't really been fixed up yet, but Mrs. Knox would have had a billiard table in here with lights above it. And even in here, there was a fireplace. And even here in this room, she wanted lots of light. So she had wells dug out so that full windows could be put in and light could come when the curtains were opened. This door leads to the true basement. We're in the basement, but it's the finished basement. The real basement, which is probably a lot more interesting than this basement, it's got all those furnaces in I talked about, and lots of pipes and lots of wires. And we don't take a tour through here, but you can get a little bit of an idea of what it looks like. And it's actually quite large. It goes all the way around and wraps around and snakes around, but it's an interesting area. Someday I'm going to do a hard hat basement tour, I think. All right, we're entering into the ballroom. This is probably the largest private ballroom here in Buffalo, and it served Mrs. Knox well. She loved entertaining, and she entertained down here quite a lot. In her day, however, there were no chandeliers. She entertained using just the sconces on the wall and candles. She thought that was more elegant. And the sconces on the wall are original to the house, as are the mirrors and all the ductwork, which, as we mentioned earlier, is from the air conditioning system. She especially wanted the ballroom to be well air conditioned so that her guests were very comfortable. The frieze along the top of the wall is Wedgwood inspired, but it's not actually Wedgwood. Someone asked me about that, and I actually got a ladder and climbed up there and found that it's just plaster. But I think it was one of Mrs. Knox's efforts to cut down on costs a little bit. Here in the ballroom, she often had an orchestra playing on the stage. She would have a 4 to 8 piece orchestra that would entertain her guests. She also had one of her Steinway pianos down here. As I had mentioned earlier, there were 4 Steinway pianos in the house, and one of them was down here in the ballroom. Like I said, she entertained quite often, and one of her most well-known encounters with the people of Buffalo and the rich and famous who visited Buffalo was in 1927 when the Peace Bridge was dedicated. And at that time, Canada was actually not completely independent from Great Britain, so that the Prime Minister of Great Britain and the Prince of Wales from Great Britain came for the dedication, and Mrs. Knox held a reception here for them. And the Prime Minister was Stanley Baldwin, who was quite famous as Prime Minister because he's the Prime Minister who refused to allow Edward VIII to marry Wallis Simpson and continue to function as the king. So he's quite famous in Britain, at least, because of that. And he was here along with the Vice President of the United States, Charles Dawes, and several other dignitaries in a reception that Mrs. Knox held for that occasion. And there's another connection between the family and King Edward VIII. Dorothy Knox, who I mentioned earlier had married Frank Goodyear, who unfortunately passed away in 1930, later remarried a fellow named Edmund Rogers. And Edmund Rogers had a brother, Henry Rogers, who happened to be the best friend of Wallis Simpson, who's the woman who married Edward VIII. And as a result, Dorothy and her second husband, Mr. Rogers, became close friends with the Duke and Duchess of Windsor and used to entertain them. Not so much here in Buffalo that we can determine, but there's lots of records of her entertaining the Duke and Duchess in her estate in Aiken, South Carolina. So the family was connected to various other, wealthy families and wealthy and influential politicians and people of fame for lots of different reasons. The flooring in here is interesting. The original floor, unfortunately, was damaged by water and had to be replaced. But when they replaced it a couple years ago, they copied the original floor exactly, so that although it's not the original floor, it's exactly a replication of that floor. And it's quite a nice floor, and it's in very good condition. I'm not sure I can say much more about this. Other than the fact that on the stage, there are 2 little stage rooms in the back. where Mrs. Knox's grandchildren, I think, probably changed costumes when they put on their annual Christmas play here in the ballroom. I think that's probably all I can really say about this room. If anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Otherwise, we'll move on. This is that other entrance that leads directly down to the ballroom. And then these stairs lead up to the servants' wing. So this is the kitchen. Obviously, it's not the original kitchen. But the Montefiore Club had torn that out and put in a commercial kitchen, which Ross tore out and replaced with this kitchen, which we use because we have family parties here and so forth, and like every household, everyone seems to congregate in the kitchen. But it's a real kitchen. It's a real refrigerator, a real dishwasher, a real stove. Everything works just like a kitchen does. That couch is actually original to the house. It has been reupholstered, but for some reason it was left over. The drinks sign there is the area where the passageway was between the kitchen and the dining room, so the servants could bring food directly from the kitchen to the dining room. And there was a dumbwaiter here, which allowed the servants to send the food down to the ballroom after they prepared it here in the kitchen. There's pantries in the back. One of them is still open. The others are kind of closed off. And that's about all I can tell you about this. And one thing I forgot to mention was when we were in the music room. Like I said, we do have some parties here once in a while. And at one of these parties, we had a string quartet playing. And these were older gentlemen. They're actually my age. And they'd played in many different venues here in Buffalo. And they told us that the acoustics in that room were better than any place they'd ever played in Buffalo. I don't know if the architect knew how to create an acoustically superior room or if it was just dumb luck. But for whatever reason, it really is a very excellent music room. And maybe someday we'll have another musical foray into that room. The other thing I forgot to mention is in all the big rooms that we were in, there's little doorbells by the doors. You might have noticed them. And those were the servant call buttons. And there was a master a control panel in here that's gone that, when you push the button in the dining room, it would have lit up and showed them that they needed to get their behinds into the dining room because someone wanted them there. Of course, that's gone now too. Of course, so are the servants. I keep pushing the buttons, but no one ever comes. And other than that, I've put together a package of booklets that you're welcome to take that describe some of the things I've talked about and should have some pictures in it. And there's also lots of pictures online of the house back in Mrs. Knox's time, which you can look up. And that pretty much concludes our tour. So thank you for bearing with it and for being patient. And come back again because we're constantly trying to improve things and bring new things back that were there at one point. And if anyone knows of any original furnishings that are around the area and that we could obtain, we'd be happy to look into it. So thanks again.